I'm showing up as an investor for the last 30 years and consultant for as many years, coaching businesses for the last 15 years. And I started a mentoring program 5 years ago as a way to connect leaders and trusted advisors. That we're balancing risk and uncertainty. Risk and certainty and risk and uncertainty. And I think that's the measure. So when Isabella and also you, Emily, and myself, when we went to another country, we looked at the risk. There is a risk and uncertainty. And how do you get to certainty? How do you get to certainty? I think it's different for all of us, but certainly in your case, Isabella, you said God. I think that's the same as hope. In your case, Emily, you took courage. I think just jumped into it. In my case, I had no choice. I was 6 years old, so I just started to adapt. But there must have been some emotion, curiosity, because I'm a child. So that's an emotion. So I'm starting to think that when I started to look at this, I put together a model that made sense for me, which is the cross between certainty and risk. So if we are very certain of ourselves and certain about the risk, what are the risks, then we'll go forward. If we're not certain about what's going on and we are risk averse, or as I think Isabella, you mentioned, rigid. If we're rigid and stuck, so we don't take action. So that's what came up for me. There's an interesting dialogue about this, and it has to do in the brain. And it has to do with the endorphins. And the three main endorphins that I look at is dopamine, I look at serotonin, and I look at cortisol. So dopamine is an endorphin that gets us to move, to take action. Serotonin is complacent. We're happy where we're at. And cortisol, we're totally unhappy. There's something wrong. So I thought, what does this have to do with life and coaching? And maybe I could tie those ends, because here's what we're looking at. You need dopamine to be able to take action. So in order for us to, let's say, do something different, we need a certain level of dopamine that gives us a reward for doing something good, like exercise. So stretch out, exercise. Of course, there's some certain level of exertion, but not too much, just enough to give you the dopamine. Of course, dopamine has different ways to showing up. Drugs, alcohol, smoking, all different things. So people are looking for dopamine. And then I looked at serotonin. Serotonin is a space that perhaps, when I listen to Magic, that describes what he's talking about, the complacent, not willing to take risks. And as I'm starting to observe, if you think of it, in your 20s and 30s, you're able to take more risk, more dopamine. When you get to your 40s or 50s, and I'm very generalizing here, serotonin kicks in to be able to protect what we have. We don't want to risk because we're happy with what we have. And cortisol probably happens at different stages, but probably maybe in the later stages. There are some stages where older people can be happy, but there's a threat of death and fear and uncertainty that happens. So maybe there's a correlation there. So when we make decisions, the question is, which endorphin do we want? Well, it depends. But certainly the key is for all of us to continue to take a certain amount of risk, but not too much risk, because that's called progress. But as Anne mentioned, she's gotten in an environment that's very complacent, that she's not willing to take the high dive anymore. And she's probably has a high level of serotonin there that she says it's a risk muscle. I think it's more dopamine. If you got dopamine in there and spiked it up, all of a sudden she would get off on the board and maybe do a smaller board and jump off. And cortisol is one of those things that is there to maybe alert us to danger, to back off, to hold back. So I look at those three things, and I think, Jody, you mentioned how do we apply this to coaching? I think being aware of these three main, there's more endorphins than that, but I look at those three main. And the key for us as coaches, as consultants, as human beings is for us to continuously stretch forward, continuously take a risk. However big that risk might be. Moving to another country is a big risk if you don't know the language, if you don't have any money, if you can't go back to where you came from. That's a huge risk, but a lot of people are doing that because they have no other choice. But in the normal life, taking a certain level of risk, that gets us to a point that then it becomes uncomfortable to take a higher risk or dangerous, then we back off. The speaker talked about, or a question I was asked about, action adventure athletes. And my, at least understanding is, they take huge risk from the outset. They may be climbing a high mountain, but they prepare and prepare and prepare. So the risk mitigation is smaller because they do want to live. So it's an interesting perspective at that level. So I start to look this from the lens of flow state. You have the challenges at one end, and you have the skills on the other end. And in the middle, you have a line going forward. And it's our obligation, our duty as coaches to help our clients take a more higher risk.